Chapter 2. Loyalty or compromise. But he that received the seed into stony places, the same is he that heareth the word, and anon with joy receiveth it, yet hath he not root in himself, but dureth for a while. For when tribulation or persecution ariseth because of the word, by and by he is offended. Matt. 13:20-21. In these last days the devil is to manifest more subtle, cunning and persuasive influences than ever before. So powerful are these deceptions that if it were possible, he shall deceive the very elect. One of his most effective seductions is the use of menticide, thought control, or brainwashing. In the past he has used force, compulsion, and terror, but now he has revised his tactics to use psychological persuasions and intellectual enticements. This modern warfare has been changed from capturing and torturing a man's body to carefully and skillfully subverting his mind. It is increasingly essential to our salvation that we become aware of Satan's new warfare of mental intrusion. Strong character can tolerate much physical agony, which often tends to increase stubborn resistance, but to withstand mental invasion requires a much stronger constitution and an unyielding will. Some men are easily subdued by the enticements of passion, money, or social status. Others will abandon truth from the pressures of authoritative demands, public opinion, or the persuasions of intellectual superiors. Thus, through a gradual process of mental erosion, many men are led to believe that their own standards are insignificant or that they really don't matter. This is when a man's perspective and his values are lost. Yielding one's will to the will of others is often accomplished through a careful, systematic and camouflaged process of indoctrination. Many methodical and subversive influences today are gradually swaying the masses into passive submission. An individual, an organization, or even a nation can be gradually and carefully molded into prejudice, pacifism, war, or servitude. A thorough investigation into the modern fields of advertising, the right bracket news media, and the messages of both political and religious leaders exemplify the clever inducements and the cunning subterfuges of our present society. Communism is one of the most effective instruments of brainwashing. A good example of their final product was described by a Lutheran minister who wrote, "I will never forget my first encounter with a Russian prisoner. He told me that he was an engineer. I asked him if he believed in God. If he would have said no, I would not have minded it much. It is the right of every man to believe or disbelieve. But when I asked him if he believed in God, he lifted his eyes toward me without understanding and said, 'I have no such military order to believe. If I have an order, I will believe.' Tears ran down my cheeks. I felt my heart rent in pieces. Here stood before me a man whose mind was dead, a man who had lost the greatest gift God has given to mankind, to be an individual. He was a brainwashed tool in the hands of the communists, ready to believe or not on an order. He could not think any more on his own. This was a typical Russian after all these years of communist domination. Tortured for Christ, Richard Wurmbrand, 1969, page 14. To yield one's standards can often be the result of an emotional trauma rather than an intellectual conclusion. An upsetting experience may cause a man to lose his mental or spiritual resistance. It is then that he becomes puzzled or confused and begins to lose his reason. When doubts prevail, a man will distrust his own judgment and will rely on others to do their thinking for him. Thus he loses his individuality and becomes committed to mental or physical servitude. The ultimate objective of the Inquisition, in the Middle Ages, was to depersonalize people, blending them all into one thought, and to dominate them by one centralized despot. Such mental and physical subversion is the ultimate objective of every dictator and totalitarian government. The mind that must exist upon the thinking of another is a pawn. It becomes an egoless robot. And when a man is willing to renounce his individualism and succumb to the dictates of another, he then becomes a mental and right bracket physical slave. In such a condition he is conditioned to be obedient to anything, right or wrong, upon the order of some superior. Such men become traitors to themselves, to their friends, their nation and even their God. But to every sin there is a justification, and for every failure there is an excuse. Juste Milou, an internationally famous psychologist, who was himself faced with imprisonment and interrogations during World War II, studied many such case histories. He interrogated many men, on both sides of the war, who had made compromises with their enemies. He said that in almost every case these men presented a self-satisfying justification. Milou wrote, "In my study of political traitors and collaborators, I found that most of them shared two common characteristics. They were easily influenced by minds stronger than their own, and none of them would admit his disloyalty as an act of treason. The traitors I interviewed always volunteered innumerable justifications of their behavior, always surrounded their treachery with a complicated web of sophisms and rationalizations. Actually, they could not tolerate an objective picture of their actions. If they did, they would condemn themselves out of their own mouths. Unconsciously, most of them realized the nature of their crimes, and were tormented by guilt feelings. These guilt feelings would have been unbearable if they admitted, even to themselves, the enormity of their deeds. The Nazis also played a strange game with some authors and artists who had not received enough appreciation. The enemy flattered these men by buying and praising their work. The artists were first told that they could write and create as they pleased, without fear of interference. Gradually, little political services were asked of them, tiny little concessions like a favorable report of a meeting, or a favorable reference to a philosophy with which they did not agree. It is the impact of that first little concession that starts the inner avalanche of self-justification that finally leads to self-betrayal. Following the first compromise and self-justification comes the second, and this one is met with shrewder self-exculpations. After all, the compromiser has had experience in rationalization by now. The repeated concessions turn into submission and voluntary cooperation. As I said before, once a man is seduced into a small ideological concession, it is very difficult for him to stop. From now on his imagination produces enough justifications which help him maintain his self-respect. Rape of the Mind, Mirlu, page 239. Throughout the annals of history, every totalitarian form of government, large or small, has compelled men to sacrifice a portion of their freedom. Freedom is lost when a person totally surrenders himself to the rule of another man or government. Every form of dictatorship is based upon this premise. Indeed, it is necessary for totalitarianism to survive. Thus, the more freedom is sacrificed, the more powerful the dictator. And so it continues until the individual becomes a tool without a conscience, a slave without a mind. Those who understand the principle of freedom best can appreciate it most. Press. John Taylor, who was called the champion of liberty, once wrote, "I was not born a slave. I cannot, will not be a slave. I would not be slave to God. I'd be his servant, friend, his son. I'd go at his behest, but would not be his slave. I'd rather be extinct than be a slave." Life of John Taylor B. H. Roberts, page 424. One of the most significant factors of freedom is the independence that it creates in a man. When he obtains total freedom, he is politically and religiously dependent upon no one. He learns to think and act for himself. It is then that he assumes the right and the responsibility for a blessing or cursing through his own decisions. With such independence, he can blame no one, nor can anyone else claim credit for the results of his acts. So freedom ends where submission begins. And so does the right for individual blessing or reward. Thus both the physical and mental forces of opposition are needed to prove, to test, and to mold a man into a saint or a sinner. It is in such a condition that a man can prove his valiancy and loyalty to his faith. Under these mental or physical pressures, some men are prone to submission, but to others, it creates that stubbornness of will to resist. This is one of the strange factors in human experience, but it is necessary to develop loyalty to principle in every man's character. The attributes of loyalty or disloyalty are as much of an integral part in a man's character as intelligence. It is like honesty, an inherent quality that will always bloom under the proper conditions. But Satan's ultimate objective is to convert men's faith and loyalty away from God. One of the first steps the Prince of Darkness uses is to force a man to betray himself. He knows that once a man makes a compromise, verbal or written, to a minor truth, it soon becomes easy for him to make concessions in his major values. A man's faith in God is lost when he places his faith in other men. This is brought about when confidence turns to trust, and respect becomes reverence. Thus from such loyalty they blindly follow other men, right or wrong, until their loyalty to God has been overthrown. Hence, men often revere the instrument more than its creator. Many religious leaders who are thus revered soon lose sight of their own dependence upon God, and become intoxicated with power, honorary titles and their own self-esteem. Then the masses, who look to them for guidance and the word of God, become guided by the arm of flesh and the word of man. Men should learn this simple lesson that whatever influence or power seeks to contradict or change God's eternal laws or his ordinances or abandon true principles, that force is from the devil. It is when men believe in some perverted system rather than the gospel of Christ that the devil has been victorious in destroying the loyalty to God. Satan's final objective has been reached. It is necessary then that a man's loyalty to a cause or to principles be tested by various forms of opposition. For men, like gold, must be tried in the furnace of affliction and opposition. Loyalty cannot be bought, for disloyalty may offer a higher price. Loyalty cannot be enforced or extracted, because compulsion is the root of slavery. Even a loyalty oath is the first step toward thought control and servitude. Taking an oath does not make men loyal. It doesn't create loyalty, nor does it prove that he will always remain loyal. Such an oath is a form of mental blackmail. If anything, it creates suspicion and distrust. Allegiance is a voluntary and self-chosen expression that grows with knowledge and experience. Loyalty oaths are in themselves an act of disloyalty, for they usually force a man to submit to something he does not believe. Therefore, any form of mental, verbal, or written compromise is a form of treason. The very definition of treason is to give away loyalty or secrets to aid the enemy or to take part in a conspiracy against your friends or your principles. For this reason, a loyalty oath may itself be an oath of treason. True loyalty is faithfulness to true principles. Hence, brutal physical assaults by an enemy may be dangerous, but they can often be healed or restored. However, the inconspicuous manipulation of the mind which dissuades man from his convictions may be catastrophic. Physical damages may be temporary, but the mental or spiritual damages of deception or compromise of principle may be eternal.